in 1 John chapter 4 that if I'm going to be like Christ, then people, when they see me concerning the love, when it means to be Christ, know whose disciple that I am. And if I'm Christ's disciple, then they can look at me by the way I carry myself, by the way I conduct myself, by the way I dress. Everything I do is based on the fact that I am the one chosen by God to be one of His children, and the privilege comes with that said you better act right and you better pay attention. So when somebody sees me as a child of God, do I reflect what Jesus would want to see in the mirror? Because after all, what it means to be a Christian is to be Christ-like as much as possible. You know, I'm proud of the fact that I was privileged to serve 8 years in the military. But I'm more proud of the fact that God allows me to serve in His army as a gospel preacher, but most importantly as a Christian, because I'm more proud of that. You see, because I can tell you this, in serving in the military and sweating and doing the things I did and traveling the country, it's harder to live in this world today as a Christian probably than it ever has been. Because the devil's even trying harder today to bring us down and knock us to the ground the best he can, because he's trying to win. The devil being that roaring lion walking around seeking who may devour. Why? Because that's his job. But here's the thing. When you think about the idea of what it says in Matthew chapter 22, and when Jesus is asked this confounding question by a lawyer, when he says, I understand the first command, but tell me then what the second command is. And Jesus not only answers the question, but then proceeds to tell him a story, or a parable rather, on what it means to be somebody's neighbor. Now here's what we think when we think of neighbor. We think of the person across the fence, right? That's not what Jesus is talking about. Because when you think about this popular question in the rabbinical world at that time was something that needed to be expounded upon. You see, they tried all these different routes in concerning Jesus of what, how, and they wanted Him to answer the question, but Jesus knew where they were going. So He goes all the way back to Leviticus chapter 19 and verse 18, and He gives them the answer there. He says, Thou shalt not avenge nor bear any grudge against the children of the people, but thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. I am the Lord. This was nothing new. They understood the law. They knew the law, and here was one who transcribed the law, and he should have known the question. But Jesus, being the master teacher that He was, didn't write him off, didn't say you should know this. He said, let me tell you something. There was the story of the Samaritan, and many people oftentimes want to add good in there. Nowhere in the Bible does it call him good, but we put that spin on it because it was good in what he did. But here you have the Samaritan that comes along after two had already passed by, and Jesus says now He takes him to an inn because he'd been beaten and robbed by thieves, takes care of him, even puts more money down on the table to make sure that he's taken care of afterwards, and says, you know what, if you run out of money when I come back through, I'll pay you again. Jesus said, now I want you to tell me concerning his neighbor, which one of these individuals showed mercy or showed compassion? And the lawyer didn't have to think very long with the question to answer it. He said, the one who showed mercy. So what it means then to love somebody, to love your neighbor as yourself, it means to show mercy. And Jesus said it also means to have compassion. But here's the problem. I want you to think about Hebrews 12 and verse 2, where it says, looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, who for the joy that was set before Him endured the cross, despising, in the Greek literally means to look down upon the shame, and is now set down at the right hand of the throne of God. Now think about this. The Bible tells us we are to look to the cross, but the problem today is we don't look, we just glance. Because we're not looking at Christ and what He did, we're just glancing past it, and we're thankful that He did it, but we don't really pay attention to why He did it. Because everybody that was around Him, He was showing compassion and mercy to as He was hanging on the cross of Calvary that fateful day as He was dying for my sins. But here's the other problem. The world has a misunderstanding of what God's love is. In the Bible, over 400 times the word love is represented throughout its various forms. And we understand that our relationship to God is tied through love. For God so loved the world that He gave His only begotten Son, John 3:16. But God commended His love towards us, and that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us, Romans 5:8. So we understand that our relationship to God is tied on the basis of love. He loved us because we love Him because He first loved us. But the Bible also tells us that God has another side that the world often forgets. Romans 11:22 says, behold the goodness and the severity of who God is. You see, the world just wants to concentrate on love, but they also don't understand that without love, there's also no mercy. Because love shows mercy. But love also shows justice. Because here's the idea at the same time. There's not a parent in this room that will tell you they like to discipline their children, but they do it based on the idea of what love is, because you don't want them to do it again. God tells us to show love. We've got to understand compassion, and we've got to understand mercy. So then what does it mean to love my neighbor as I am to love myself? Well, the idea of neighbor, as the dictionary tells us, is a person who lives near another person. But here's the other definition that it gives us. One's fellow human being, to be generous toward another who is less fortunate than us. So really what it means to love my neighbor is to love those who are less fortunate than I am. So here, let me ask you this. Today, many people give lip service when it comes to loving their neighbor. They say it, but they don't do it. Here's the other idea when we think about love. Love is an action verb. It means that we have to show it, that we cannot simply say it. It wouldn't go very far in my household if I just told my wife on a daily basis that I loved her, but never showed her. Why? Because she wouldn't stand for it. There was a lady by the name of Miss Bessie, or Miss Betty, when I was in Tennessee, when I was going to college. And her husband had been married for almost 50 years at this point, and I think they were hitting their 45th or 50th or one of those years concerning the anniversary. And I remember asking her and talking to her about them being married that long. She said, "Larry, can I tell you something?" I said, "Absolutely." She said, "Do you know that we've been married almost 50 years and he's only told me that he loves me one time? And that was on the day that we got married." And I'm thinking, whoo, how did he survive this long? But she said, "But he shows me every single day." She said, "I don't need to hear it." But she said, "I see it every day in his actions and the way he treats me, and the way he shows compassion and mercy and love towards me." She said, "That's all I need." So when it comes to the idea of loving our neighbors as we love ourselves, and that second great command that God gives, first and foremost, that we are to love Him with everything, and Christ said, okay, so you understand the idea of what it means to love God with every ounce of your being and all the things that you have, to put everything into it. Here's the idea then. I want you to take that love and show the world what it means to love me by loving them. So we understand then 1 John 4:8 says that he that loveth not knoweth not God, for God is love. So if we don't love God with everything, you can't love somebody else with all that God gives you. Because then what happens is we become selfish. So when we think about what it means to love our neighbors, today I want to answer that question with the typical who, what, when, where, how, and why of how we are to love our neighbors as we love ourselves. Many times I get really disappointed in the brethren in the Lord's church because this is where it starts. And sometimes we treat the world better than we treat our own brethren. And when we do that, well, how does the world see the church? We talk about our brethren, we speak down to them, we go out, we speak badly about our elders, the decisions they made, and we don't like those decisions, the things our deacons are doing we don't agree with, what the preacher said on Sunday to upset me and make me squirm in my seat a little bit. So we go out in the world, we run the church down, but then we say, "Hey, you want to come to church with me?" You know what they say? "Have you lost your mind? Because I'm going to show up and you're just going to talk about me." What does it mean then to love our neighbors as we love ourselves? The Bible tells us that we are to respect ourselves, love ourselves, because that love which is in us is also in Christ Jesus. So let me answer the question first, that who is my neighbor? And this is the same question that was asked by another in the Bible. When you look at Luke 10:29, that lawyer, and after understanding the first and second command, said, "Then who is my neighbor?" And again, that's where Jesus gives the idea of the Samaritan here in Luke chapter 10. But then Jesus said, "Now, which of these three concerning that do you think was the one that was the neighbor?" And he showed the one that had mercy, and Jesus said, "That's right. And a neighbor is anyone who is willing to help in time of need." But why is it that we have to wait to help somebody till they're in need? People need help all the time. We just don't see it. People are struggling all the time. Galatians 6, Paul says, "Bear you one another's burdens." Sometimes we can't even bear our own, much less help somebody else. But we learn from this parable that a neighbor isn't somebody that's just next door. It's somebody who needs us that we need to be paying attention to. And first and foremost, let me tell you where it starts. It starts at the home. It starts first with husbands loving their wives, wives loving their husbands, parents respecting their children, children respecting their parents. It all starts there in the nucleus of the household, because when we teach each other to love within the household and its confines, we're going to do it outside also when we get to the church building and when we're out in the world. You see, it's not the preacher's job to raise your children. It's not the elder's job to raise your children, ladies and gentlemen. It's your job as a parent to raise your children. Because God said that's your first and greatest gift concerning the blessing that He gave you, is to raise somebody to be a Christian. You have that responsibility. Fathers, provoke not your children to wrath, but bring them up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. So understand the great responsibility. So what it means to love my neighbor, first, it starts within the confines of the walls of my house. And when I show compassion, and sometimes I also show discipline, they understand that it's done on the basis of love. But you see, that twist of the old proverb, if we want to have neighbors, then we need to be a neighbor. That's what it means to love our neighbors as we also love ourselves. But what does it mean then to love? Today, many people define love as having deep emotions for another person. And they get it absolutely wrong and many times. But is that how the Bible defines love? Before we can love, we have to have other Christian graces that Peter talks about in 2 Peter chapter 1. Peter says, and besides this, giving all diligence, add to your faith virtue, and to your virtue knowledge, and to knowledge temperance, and to temperance patience, and to patience brotherly kindness, and to brotherly kindness charity. So I build upon all those things, and the last thing that I add into all those things that God tells me is love. I've got to have love. But sometimes that's the one emotion and the one thing that we're afraid to show more than anything else. You see, in 1 Corinthians 14, 4 through 7 teaches us what love is. Love never puffs itself up. Love doesn't envy. Love is not strifeful. Love doesn't hate. All these things that Paul is telling the Corinthian church because they were fighting among themselves, said this is what it means to love. You've got to love your neighbor first, just as you're going to also love yourself. Love then isn't merely a deep emotion for someone, but it's seeking the highest good for that person. Oftentimes when I counsel couples before they get married, I always ask them what their definition of love is. Oh, well, that's because he's handsome and he's got beautiful eyes. That's usually what the girl tells me. Or she's beautiful and she cares for me and she's got the gentlest touch and the greatest heart. And I said, those are all fine and good. But let me really tell you what love means when you get married and when the rubber meets the road. Because I said, all those feelings you're having now and the sparkles that are flying are going to be gone the day you say, I do. I said, let me tell you what love means when it means to be married. I said, love means you love somebody more than you love yourself. That's what it means to be married. Marriage isn't a 50-50 relationship. Sometimes it's give and take. Somebody gives more than the other. That means I love my neighbor more than I love myself. That means I'm willing to give of myself and my means in whatever way possible. That's how and what love is then. Jesus said, greater love hath no man than this, than to lay down his life for his friend, as we were told last night. That's the greatest idea of what love means, is to sacrifice for somebody else, even if I don't know them, that I'm willing to give for them. We have some very good family friends that I've known since I was 12 years old that lived at Tallulah at the time, but now live in Delhi, Louisiana, which I'm sure most of you know where that is. My parents were driving through in the middle of the summer in 1986 as my dad was getting stationed in Meridian, Mississippi. Now, my mom's a southern woman, and she's got a cast on her arm, and she does not like the South in the summertime. And it was hot. And my dad's pulling a trailer, and he's got the dog in the back. Me and my brother were at my grandparents' already in Louisiana, and the car breaks down on the side of the road. It's 105 degrees in June in North Louisiana, and they're broke down on I-20. And all of a sudden, this truck turns around and pulls up and gets out and says, what's the problem? So my dad says, well, I think it's the fuel pump, and I'm going to have to replace that. And this was a Saturday morning, but nothing at that time was open like we have now with everything convenient. And he said, I'll tell you what, you two are coming to stay at my house. This man didn't know my parents from Adam. But he said, you are going to come stay at my house till we get your truck fixed on Monday, and we'll take care of that. Come to find out, they were members of the church there at Tallulah. Imagine that. Christians showing, and they didn't know my parents were Christians at the time, Christians showing what it means to love your neighbor as you love yourself. It meant he was going out of his way. He didn't have to stop. He didn't have to pull over. It meant he was going out of his way to help somebody else because he saw that they were in need. They needed something. So that's what it means to love. Do we have this kind of love towards our own neighbors then? It's not just the next door neighbor. It's our neighbors in general, anybody who's around us that we need to show compassion to. That's where evangelism starts. Isn't that how Jesus started with His evangelism? First by showing love for those who were in need, by showing compassion and healing those who needed to be healed, by providing for those who were hungry first before He taught them. That's what it means to love our neighbors. But when should I love my neighbor? Well, certainly I bet you your response is going to be this all the time, right? And that would be correct. Proverbs 17:17 says, "A friend loveth at all times." And that's absolutely right. But here's the thing. Love does not just feel as we noted above. Love also acts. So I've got to show it. Don't give me lip service. I want you to show me that you love me. I want you to show the people in your community that you love them by the things in which you do. We're really good in the church about giving lip service, aren't we? Jews were the same way. Oh, Lord, if you help us out of this, we'll make sure that we do it right the next time. You know what the Greek word for that is? As Brother Moses used to say, baloney. Because they messed it up every time, didn't they? Lord, we'll do it this time. No, you won't. You say you will, but you don't do it. You see, love doesn't just feel, love acts. So, do we act upon loving our neighbors? And if so, how do we do it? It doesn't have to be anything major. It's something small in which we act and what we show. Love shows forth when we hand somebody a pamphlet or we invite them to church. You know what that's saying? I love your soul and I care about your soul. So let me come tell you about what a man did for me on the cross at Calvary. But first of all, when we have opportunity, Galatians 6:10 says, as we have opportunity, let us do good to all men, but especially those of the household of faith. So first, it starts at the house. Then it starts within the brotherhood, and we're taking care of each other and looking out for each other. And then it starts in the community. But you know what? It's hard. And I'm not going to say that it's not. Any preacher in here can tell you about those who come knocking on your door at the building that need a handout. The sad thing is, I bet you any preacher in this room will tell you the first thing they think is, what line are they trying to pass me now? And we do. Because there are so many people that come to the church building, especially where I'm at in Fayette, that are looking for a handout, that are walking in carrying a $300 iPhone, that are driving a Cadillac Escalade outside, and they want me to help them pay their light bill. I got a problem with that. When your car and your phone is better than mine, then there's a problem with that. But here's the thing. I've repented many times of that attitude. I don't know their situation. I don't know why they've come to me. Maybe they've gone out down on their luck. Maybe he lost his job. Maybe he's about to lose his car. Maybe these are all things that he's already provided for himself. Now don't get me wrong. I do have some who come through there who are absolute frauds. And I can see right through them most of the time. But there are some that actually come there that need help. And many times the attitude we have is we go on the defensive wanting to know what they're trying to get from us rather than what they need from us. What they need is compassion and love. What they need is to see as a Christian that's willing to lend a hand and help. You know, I've known of many people who have come to Christ because of compassion. Brother Jerry Martin is one of those. Brother Jerry Martin will tell you where Charles preaches, where Jerry Martin grew up, will tell you it's because somebody had compassion on them when he was growing up with all those kids and they were poor and broke, that somebody thought enough of them to bring them food and bring them to church. Want to know what? He's a faithful gospel preacher now. Why? Because somebody loved their neighbor just as they were to love themselves. So understand who, what, and when I'm supposed to love my neighbor means all the time. James 4:17 says, therefore to him that knoweth to do good and doeth not, to him is it a sin. So if I know I'm supposed to do something and then I don't do it, guess what? God's got a problem with that. So here's the idea. Acts 2:5 says that the church, the early church, were willing to sell their possessions and give to those who were in need. Why? Because they saw a need that needed to be taken care of. So where should I love my neighbor then? I know who, I know what, but where should I love my neighbor? And again, it starts in our home first and foremost, and then it goes to the church, but then it goes to the community. But what about at work? What about my co-workers? This includes your bosses, your subordinates, your peers. But maybe you're telling yourself this. Well, Larry, if I tell people about Jesus, and if I show them the love of Jesus, I might lose my job. You know what the Bible also tells us in 1 John chapter 4, that those who fear to tell people about God are those who sin against God? Are you scared to lose your job or your soul first? You see, that includes everybody. John 13:35 says, "By this shall all men know that you are my disciples if you have love one for another." So that means we've got to love each other first before we reach out in the community. It's also to do it when we're on vacation. You know what the psychology says? Psychologists today in the world say me time. Everybody's got to have me time. But there's no such exclusion time with a Christian. Because I've seen folks when I'm on vacation that are down and out that need help. But sometimes we're so reluctant to stop. It's dangerous in the world today, isn't it? You know, when I was growing up, I can remember my grandfather pulling over on the side of the road and picking up hitchhikers. Raise your hand if you do that today. Probably not. It's hard in the world in which we live today to love our neighbors as ourselves because of the dangers of society, yes. But that doesn't mean we stop doing those things. You see, there's no such exclusive. Philippians 2:3 says, "Let nothing be done through strife or vainglory, but in lowliness of mind, let each esteem other better than themselves. Look not every man on his own things, but every man also on the things of others." So I can't be selfish with my things, but I've got to esteem others higher than myself and look on the things they have and the needs that they have. In public, Jesus said, "Let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works and glorify your Father which is in heaven." Now, wherever we may be, whatever time that might be, and whatever place it might be, that's the place that we love our neighbor. Doesn't matter where I am. There's no confines to the boundaries of my Christianity. Just as they used to tell us in the military that you are, a Marine 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. You don't take out your coat of Christianity when you walk out that door, do you? Do you hang it up as soon as you get home and say, "Glad that's over"? No. You're a Christian 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Sometimes that's difficult. But how do I love my neighbor? When you think about the parable of the Samaritan that gives us the answer by showing mercy, Paul tells us to keep God's commandment in showing love for our neighbor. In Romans 13:9-10, Paul says, don't kill, don't steal, don't bear false witness, don't covet. And all these other commandments are briefly comprehended in this saying, "Thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. Love worketh no ill to his neighbor. Therefore love is the fulfilling of the law." What do you mean? If I love somebody and I show compassion, you mean I'm doing what God told me to do? Absolutely. But again, when we're supposed to look at the cross, many times all we do is glance at it and we're not really paying attention to what Christ did. Because Christ showed love towards His neighbor when they didn't deserve it. And He showed compassion to us when we didn't deserve it. You see, love also compels one to tell others the message of the gospel. Why wouldn't you want to share it? What are we so scared of? You scared of political correctness? Is that it? That seems to be the problem today, political correctness. You know why I love the Apostle Peter? First and foremost, he put his foot in his mouth many times just like I do. But he was also a politically incorrect preacher. Peter didn't care about being politically correct with the Romans. He didn't care about being politically correct with the Sanhedrin Council when they said, "You better quit preaching this Jesus mess, or we're going to put you in prison. Better yet, we might even kill you." Peter said, "I can't but preach the gospel of Jesus Christ, and I count myself worthy to suffer for Him." But then I think about Stephen. As Stephen stood before the council, proclaiming the message of the gospel, telling these men what they already knew, but they didn't know how they knew it. When he told them about Abraham and why Jesus came through Isaac and that seed line and what they were supposed to understand, that they knew the prophets, they knew why Jesus was going to be sent into that Messiah. And he said, "Guess what? You're the ones who killed Him." Ever tell somebody about Jesus and say, "Do you know you're the reason He went to the cross?" Whew. Speak the truth in love, right? That is love. Let me tell you about what a man did for me on the cross of Calvary. That's love. That's loving my neighbor. Let me tell you why you need Jesus. Because you're going to die alone without Him. Let me tell you why you need Jesus. Because He loved us before we ever loved Him. You see, that's what it means to love your neighbor. But why ought we to love our neighbor? Because God commands us. James said, this is the royal law. God tells me to do this. Didn't Jesus say in John 14:15, "If you love me, keep my commandments"? If you love me, keep. That's a command. That's not a do it if you want to. If you love me, you better keep my commandments. So how much do you love me? Do you love me enough to take care of somebody you don't even know? It used to drive my grandmother absolutely up a wall when my grandfather would bring people home to feed them that she didn't know. And he didn't tell her half the time. My grandfather was a gospel preacher down in Morgan City, Louisiana for 30-something years. And he used to bring people all the time, destitutes, people he'd find on the highway that were hitchhiking, and just bring them into the house to feed them. And here's my grandmother who had worked all day long, coming home, and now having to fix dinner, and my grandfather would entertain these people and then have a Bible study with them. And I think back on those times, it used to annoy me too because I was little. I was like 7, 8, 9 years old. I'm thinking, oh, who did Granddaddy bring home now? But now I look back on those things, and he was just simply doing what God told him to do. To show compassion and show love to somebody who needed it more than somebody else. You see, why ought I to love my neighbor? Because it's the greatest command that God gives us other than loving Him. Because it's also the natural result of practicing the golden rule. Therefore, whatsoever you would do to yourself, do also to somebody else. You see, because it's also simply the right thing to do. It's simply the right thing to do. You see, we've answered several questions about that second command today. And so here's the thing I want to ask you. Have you been practicing it? And if not, why not? So when you go out the door today, and when you go to work on Monday, and you walk through that door, just realize that everybody you're coming in contact with, that you're about to show compassion to, is your neighbor. And how you respond to them shows them how Jesus would also respond to them. You see, because if you don't respond correctly, then Jesus says, you are not my disciple, because they don't see you and me, or me and you. You see, 1 John 4:11 says, Beloved, if God so loved us, we ought also to love one another. That's hard. If God loves us, we ought also to love one another. 1 John 4:12 says, No man has seen God at any time. But, he says, if we love one another, guess what? They do see God. That's it. If we love each other and take care of our neighbors, then they get to see who God is and what God stands for. Greater love had no man than this, than to lay down a life for a friend. Stephen said it last night. Jesus calls me his friend. You know what it means to be a friend of Christ? And the other man that was called a friend of Christ, or a friend of God, was Abraham, as Stephen said last night. You know what it means to be a friend? That's a special relationship. I bet you can count on one hand the number of your close friends. Jesus said, I want you to be one on that hand. So if I want to love Jesus, and Jesus said, you are my friends if you do whatsoever I command you, then I don't have a choice to love my neighbor. But here's where the rubber really meets the road. I want you to find somebody that's your neighbor that you really can't stand. I want you to find that one person that annoys the mess out of you. I want you to find that one neighbor who perhaps is down the road that makes all kind of racket at 2 o'clock in the morning. You know what I want you to do? Go knock on their door at 8 o'clock and invite them to church on Sunday morning. Not that you're trying to wake them up from keeping you up or anything. But show them compassion. Show the one who shows no other person what it means to be a neighbor. You show them first what it means to be a neighbor. You know, I think Jesus gave the idea of what it means to bear and show the other cheek sometimes even when we don't want to, because we're the type of people that we like retaliation. We want to get even with people, right? Jesus said if they want to smack one cheek, give them the other. But my challenge for you is next week is to find that one person who you really wouldn't want to consider your neighbor. And I want you to show them then what it means to be a neighbor. And then show them what it means then to be a child of God and what it means to be a Christian. And then show them what it really means to suffer for the cause of Christ, because you're not going to let them steal the blessing of your salvation. And then I can guarantee you this, you'll get more out of it than they will. Because you'll have the blessing of knowing that you did exactly what Jesus told you to do. To love somebody that is perhaps you don't even know more than you even love your own self. So how much do you love your neighbor today? And how much have you showed your neighbor how much you love them? It's a difficult thing in our society today to show that, to be compassionate. Because our world is frustrating in which we live. It really is. And the other thing that happens today is that society has a misunderstanding of God's love because of this. You see, they see God as some big old softy, some grandfather. Now, I think it was Stephen or maybe it was Charles that talked about last night. I think it was Stephen talked about grandparents. You know, grandparents like to talk about their children, right? And they don't even want to discipline their grandchildren because they can do no wrong. I remember being there as I was the number one grandson, so I never did anything wrong. I was always right. But you see, the world looks at God as this big old softy grandfather. And they say, well, you know, God is never going to punish anybody. But you see, that's not the God I know. Because the Bible says, behold the goodness and the severity of God, because God is love. And He also needs people to understand that there is the other side of His love that demands justice because of what He did through His Son Jesus Christ on the cross of Calvary. And because it demands justice, it demands what? That people repent because of it. Those who step outside the lines, those who don't do what God commands them to do. You see, when that great command is given to us to love God with everything we have, and the second then is to love our neighbors also, it's a command. And when I don't do it, I transgress the law of God, and therefore I don't show forth the love that God has for me by doing what God tells me to do. It's called that law of omission. I'm leaving out, omitting the weightier things. And when we do that, we transgress His law. So how much do you love God today? And I pray as you go out in the world this week that you'll look at people a little bit differently. We're really quick to jump to conclusions when we see somebody based on the way that they're dressed. Maybe on the way they look or the color of their skin. Because he's got a do-rag on, all of a sudden we think he's a thug or something. Or because we see a guy's got cut-off sleeves and boots, we think he's a redneck and he's just an idiot. We're quick to stereotype, aren't we? I mean, we do that. But is that really loving our neighbors? Not at all. Because we're quick to point the finger instead of inviting them to Christ. You know what? I'm thankful that Christ didn't point the finger. Remember when He sat down with the publicans and the harlots? They came to see who He was because they wanted to hear Him in Luke 15. You see, these were the basis of all sinners that came to sit with Christ. That's the ones who He wanted to be a neighbor to. Not the ones who were well off. He wanted the basis of the lowest sinners that He could find, and that's the one He got down and dirty with on the ground, and that's who He ate dinner with. That was His neighbors. That's who He showed love to. And you know what? When the Pharisees didn't like it, Jesus said, I don't care. Remember when the disciples said, Lord, do you know you just offended the Pharisees? Jesus said, I don't care. I'm not here to appease them or please them or do things their way. I'm here to do it God's way. And I'm here to love these people that need to be loved. That's the great command that God gives us. Love those who need to be loved. Thank you.
Challenging and practical, wasn't it? Easy to understand, but sometimes much more difficult to do. Something he said in his sermon I've thought about a lot of times. We talk about the danger we put ourselves in when we might do something kind for someone.